Misha left off about the danger the dangerous moment we're in now, because we really don't know how far or the extent of this actual invasion.
Well, he's absolutely right that it is very dangerous. I would disagree that it's quite as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we're not yet in a nuclear standoff. But if things go down the worst possible route, then we could indeed be at that point. We are not at that point now. There's a lot of hyperbolic talk from various Ukrainian figures that we're seeing the prelude to World War III. Not yet, because NATO forces are not engaged in this. NATO has gone to some lengths to make sure that there were no uniformed serving American or British personnel, the trainers, for example, in Ukraine as Russia gathered its forces on the borders. They were training them in anti-tank weaponry. They got them out in a hurry, because as President Biden said, when you get Americans and Russians shooting at each other, that's a world war, and nobody wants that. Now, the two big key unknowns, building on what Misha was saying there, the key unknowns are, what are President Putin's intentions inside Ukraine? Does he, as Misha put it, intend to just simply carve out the Donbass and say, well, actually, now we're annexing that, it's part of Russia? Is he going for the full-on occupation, which they've said they're not going to do, but then they said they weren't going to invade, so that doesn't mean anything? Or, worst case, does he plan to build on the advantage, the momentum of this massive quarter of a million strong force, backed by all the artillery, drones, aircraft, and so on? Does he intend to go further and try to retake the Baltics? Now, no one is suggesting that at the moment, but I can tell you that people in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in government are very concerned about it. There is a tiny border called the Suwalki Gap that separates the two NATO countries of Poland and Lithuania. And Russia is separated from Kaliningrad. It's almost like a kind of enclave that's on the Baltic from Belarus. And wargamers have long been planning for how long it would take Russia if they wanted to take that stretch of border, and the answer is not very long.
But Frank, that would be war with NATO. That would be an all-out war taking on NATO. It's one thing invading Ukraine, as you say. Just help us understand sort of the moral responsibility here of NATO. And frankly, Article 5, help our audiences understand that.
So NATO's constitution has several articles in it. Article 4 has already been invoked, where they have had multilateral discussions amongst themselves. They've had an emergency meeting. Article 5 is that if one NATO member is attacked, all must come to its defense, which is one of the reasons why there was no great momentum within NATO for Ukraine to join. They didn't want a country joining NATO that is already in a form of conflict with a nuclear power, Russia. So, in a way, this was an almost unnecessary argument, because there were no plans for Ukraine to immediately join NATO. It was something that they've indicated they wanted to do. Ukraine was encouraged to think that might happen, rather like Turkey in the EU. Exactly. So, from Russia's point of view, they've looked at the map of Europe. President Putin, remember that he was an old Cold Warrior. He was a KGB lieutenant colonel who was in Dresden, in the Russian KGB office in Dresden at the time the Berlin Wall came down. And he considers that event and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the worst disaster of the 20th century. He looks at the map of Europe, and he thinks of the boundary between East and West, between NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact, and that boundary has moved massively to the east. So all those countries that used to be Soviet satellites, right in Moscow's sphere, its orbit of influence, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, as well as the former Soviet Socialist republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all those countries are not just no longer in Moscow's sphere, they are in NATO. So the prospect of Ukraine, its giant Slavic-speaking neighbor, which he considers is part of wider, bigger Mother Russia, the idea of that formalizing its Western sympathies by joining NATO and the EU is anathema to him.
I mean, you know, you'll remember famously he said to George W. Bush, Ukraine's not really a country. And then in 2008, when the whole idea of joining NATO, he went after Georgia and punished Georgia. Then we saw the invasion in 2014. So really, he's always made his intentions very clear.
He has, and I think that this invasion was planned a long time ago. I mean, you don't amass an invasion force like this with pontoon bridges and blood banks and artillery and air support. You don't do that over just a few days. This is something that would have been in plan for a long time. So all those days when Western leaders were shuttling to and fro to Moscow, talking about diplomatic windows, the plans had already been drawn up. I'm quite certain of it. What would have put him off? Not sanctions. I think that this is, I'm not saying sanctions are a good or a bad idea, but I don't think they have a big effect on President Putin. He's already factored those in. He's worked that out. He knew they were going to, I mean, possibly the delay or temporary cancellation of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That is a blow, but it's a blow to the West as well. He would have factored all of this in, and to him, President Putin and his immediate circle, bringing Ukraine back into what he sees as Moscow's sphere of influence, Moscow's orbit, that trumps everything. That's more important to him than anything else. There is nothing at the moment to indicate that he wants to invade a NATO country. So we shouldn't be at risk, tense as it is. We should not be at risk of a wider conflict. But that depends on NATO and Russia staying well apart.
Frank, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.